Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets, from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com. So greetings and welcome, Pippa. It's fantastic to have you on the podcast. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Now, before we go into the heart of our conversation, I do always like to ask of my guests something about their origin story. So in your case, what did you study at university, and was it inevitable you would end up in the, I don't know, it's hard to sort of label you, but kind of advisory to sort of policymakers, economics, startup entrepreneurship world that you're in now?
Yeah, my dad worked for 4 presidents, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford. And so in retrospect, I was trained by someone who was operating at the level of the Oval Office. And so my dad taught me a lot of things that ended up being really valuable when I went into finance and then into politics and geopolitics and, things like there's the front page of the Washington Post and then there's the actual story of what really happened. And he always said you have to know the difference between the two. And I didn't think it was a natural progression. And I ended up studying just the things I found interesting. So as an undergrad, I did a lot of political philosophy and military history, and people were like, you'll never get a job. And then later, I literally ended up briefing NATO generals and, teaching at the Royal College of Defense Studies in Sandhurst, which is Britain's equivalent of West Point. And I guess that's the key. My dad taught me how to look at the world as if it's all connected, that you can't just say, oh, I only do geopolitics, or I only do markets, or I only do deep tech. You have to know something about all of these things. And maybe the best way to describe it is most people seem to look at the world's investors, look at the world as if they're using portrait mode on their phone to take a picture. And I like to use landscape. It's just a completely different way of understanding reality.
That's great. Yeah. You have such a diverse sort of background and range of interests. It really is. I really enjoy reading your material that you produce and also speaking to you. Now, I guess one point to start with, and it's hard to ignore, is the US and President Trump. Obviously, a lot's been going on. Since the recent weekend, the assassination attempt. We recently heard about the vice president nominee that he has, J.D. Vance. So it kind of seems like at least people in markets think that it's inevitable that Trump will win. So the odds have gone up quite dramatically. And then people are trying to draw parallels between his first term in office, that he's, in some ways, it's going to be similar in the second term. But, in your eyes, like, what are some of your thoughts around, what we've seen so far this year? Obviously, Biden's, health and his competency has been sort of questioned. I mean, how are you thinking about what we've seen so far this year, and also what we should look out for the election?
Sure. And just for the audience, for background, I was an advisor to George W. Bush on the National Economic Council. And then I've been an advisor to the British cabinet as well. So, and a number of other prime ministers around the world. So I speak from that angle. I think Trump is literally going to come in with the strapline, "No more Mr. Nice Guy," which is really saying something. And people are very nervous about what are the implications of that. But that doesn't mean a kind of violent, harsh retribution approach. It means he thinks that his job is to pare down the federal government, cut back the bureaucracy and the technocracy, and that he didn't accomplish that in his first term. And now he knows much more about how the system works, and he will be much more aggressive in accomplishing the tasks that he set out in the first term. And I think the choice of J.D. Vance is very telling, because he is speaking to the audience that he believes has been left behind, right? This is the hillbilly elegy community who, Washington traditionally talks about the middle of the United States as the, quote, flyover zone. And I learned when I worked for George W. Bush that that is the part of the country that defines the values of the nation, It is the center of innovation. We think it's Silicon Valley, but that's actually just one very limited part of the innovation story in America. It's the middle that really grows the economy, makes it move forward. And now Silicon Valley doesn't have a lock on that anymore. Money's going to Nashville and Austin and Detroit. And so he is speaking not just to the kind of hillbilly crowd that maybe international observers assume. He's also talking to these entrepreneurs that are from the middle and have very big ambitions and feel that they're fighting the bureaucracy out of Washington all the time. So, it's interesting too that he has reached out to Robert Kennedy, who has been performing vastly better in the polls than most people had understood. He pretty much owns the under 45-year-old vote in the United States. And Kennedy, in my judgment, Trump and Kennedy have had a conversation for quite a long time. This is not new. They're very aligned on many things, not on the environment. They have different priorities, but they're very aligned on the, end the forever wars, spend the money on the U.S. developing this economy, not on some foreign war zone. And so I wonder whether there's going to be a way those two collaborate. And then that would also temper, change, influence the way that Trump runs the second term. So bottom line, I remember when Trump was elected, I personally wrote a paper in 2015 saying, I think Trump can and will become president. And people were like, you are insane. That is like impossible for that to happen. And it wasn't a preference. It was just an observation of the forces at work. These are the same kinds of observations that led me to start arguing Kennedy is really important to watch as of a year ago. So using those same observational powers, I think that people have to be very careful to separate their emotion from their analysis. And Trump brings a huge amount of emotion to the surface. So many people will be like, well, I don't like Trump, therefore I'm selling the US economy. They did that when he was first elected, and it turned out to be the wrong trade. And I think it's going to turn out to be the wrong trade this time too.
Okay. And in the significance of bringing Kennedy kind of into the tent, the purpose of, or the benefit of that is that it makes Trump more effective in implementing some of his ideas, or what's this Kennedy aspect? I mean, what's the significance of that in terms of any future Trump administration?
I think number one, it brings in the youth. That's very, very important. Number two, there are lots of issues that Kennedy has been spearheading that the president will find too technical and not really interesting to him. Getting healthier food into the school system, for example, is not going to be Trump's highest priority, but he does appreciate that it's an issue and he might want someone to handle that. They both, by the way, very much agree that entrepreneurs are building the future, and so we shouldn't be taxing them. The question is, where are they on the big corporates? Kennedy's position is the big corporates are mainly paying zero because they have the best lawyers and are able to manage that. Trump also feels there's something not right there, but he's probably more pragmatic about how to bring that pressure to bear on them with fundraising in mind. So I bet both of them are kind of aligned on those points as well. I think, look, also Trump understands that this is a time where the country needs to be reunited. And that means reaching out to people that have formerly been your opponents or don't agree with you. And J.D. Vance is a great example of that. And he's not the first, right? Remember, Mike Pompeo used to be very anti-Trump and ended up...
the sort of never Trumpers.
Yeah. So, part of it is bringing people into the tent that in the past totally disagreed with you in order to demonstrate that it's possible to align people, even when they're really vociferously opposed to your positions.
And, one of the features of Trump's first administration was that it appeared to be very chaotic in terms of decision making. From a market's perspective, sort of the visibility was quite poor. Whether you agreed with the policies or not, you just want some consistency and some level of transparency. I mean, do you think that will be different this time around, given that he's had time to gain some experience and prepare better, perhaps?
I think he's going to tell you what he's going to do. Like, I am going to shut down this department, and then he will. Now, will the markets be delighted to be informed and then feel confident? They probably won't. They'll be like, wait, what? Wait, this department does things that are important. So the fight isn't going to be over uncertainty. It's going to be over the implications of the action.
Yes, understood. Okay, no, that's clear. And some people have been referencing this Project 2025, which is this sort of manifesto almost that was produced by one of these think tanks, the Heritage Foundation, which leans to the right. And, people are kind of questioning, is that sort of Trump's manifesto ultimately, or is there something that is just out there in the think tank world? And one of the big aspects of this is that it's to reduce the size of federal government, but also it's about giving the president a lot more power as well. And there's also a moral aspect of it as well in terms of bringing more kind of moral social policy and so on. What are your thoughts on this Project 2025?
So President Trump himself the other day said, I have no idea. This is not my project. And it was actually important and perhaps clever as well. So I think he can pick and choose what he wants to be associated with or not. And frankly, even if there are things in that project that he decides to pursue, he's not going to say it's because of that. He's going to say my decision, and they happen to agree with me. Look, Washington is full of think tanks that are full of people who believe they should be in power. And when they're not in power, when their president is not inside, they go sit there and they wait until their party comes back. That doesn't mean that every president sees them as their staff. Now, usually, if you were in a traditional party system, a president would just hire all those folks back. But Trump is different, and he has a different agenda for the country. So I don't think he's following anybody else's playbook. Even if he might take a play or two out of it, it's going to be Trump's playbook, not the think tank's playbook.
And one fear many people have, especially on the left, is this whole threat to U.S. democracy. The checks and balances being taken away. Political appointees of the technocracy. Which maybe this retribution thing, like going after political opponents. How much of a risk do you think that is for us to consider?
I think there's a really significant risk now. When I first went overseas to study at the London School of Economics, I had some friends who came from very powerful political families. And I remember them saying, my father was sometimes in the cabinet of my country, but when he wasn't, he was in prison. And that's the way it worked. You were either in power or you were in prison, and you've spent your whole career bouncing back and forth between these two locations. The US was traditionally not like this, but it is becoming like this. And so is there going to be, a retribution-oriented witch hunt for those who are responsible for policies that the president perceives to be damaging to the nation? I suspect there is going to be. Now, is accountability a terrible thing by itself? No. So it all depends on how is it done? And is the purpose of it just to hit your opponents, or is it really to demonstrate that certain policies were not done in good faith or did not serve the public interest, in which case there's a reasonable case that ought to be pursued. So a lot of it will have to do with tone. And one of the issues that President Trump has is that his tone is always so combative and strident. It's really interesting how he says things and everybody gets very emotional and upset. And then someone else will say exactly the same thing and it will go down okay. By the way, Kennedy and Trump are similar this way. Kennedy can say the same thing and his tone is so sort of friendly and accommodative. And, dare I say, he's very love-led, right? He speaks from a very heartfelt space. So tone matters. And yet, I guess there's the question, if you're trying to completely restructure what you perceive to be a vastly overgrown and over-empowered federal government, can you do it politely? Can you do it nicely? Or does it require someone who, swears and sounds really combative? I think Trump's position is, this is a fight. That's an interesting question. Can it be done gently? Perhaps not.
And in terms of the impact for markets, it sounds like it should be, if Trump was to win, that should be a positive environment for equities in general, from the sounds of what you're saying.
No, I think this is too simplistic. We've got to really think through some very big announcements that are coming. One is a probable announcement on Bitcoin. And the introduction of digital assets into the economy. I've long argued that the U.S. is going to make digital assets like Bitcoin and others legal tender, and that actually the U.S. is probably now the largest owner of Bitcoin as a sovereign, mainly through confiscation. And the thing is, why? Because it would bring a lot of Black economy activity into the light, partly because it would be a discipline on the way that the dollar has been managed and Federal Reserve policy. My sense is that Trump, especially because he comes from a property background, he really likes cheap money and will want cheap money to continue. So what are the implications of that for the inflation outlook? And how aggressive will the bond market be in response to that? That's an open question. Equities may like that, but bonds may not like that. So that all depends as well on the level of technological innovation. Because when you have cheap money, yes, it causes inflation pressures to rise. But if you also use that cheap money to generate a lot of innovation, it pushes down on the pricing side. So maybe we get a tighter range between inflation and innovation. And I do see it as a kind of race between those two things. And honestly, the United States, I would always bet innovation is going to win, right? The US is incredibly innovative. And also we've got all these new sectors in the economy that are opening up that are partly a function of Trump's policies, partly they're just happening of their own accord. But one of them is we are seeing the relocalization of supply chains, and the U.S. is becoming ever more competitive in manufacturing. It is no longer cheaper to make stuff in China. You can manufacture, particularly in the alliance between the U.S. and Mexico. And, immigration has been such a huge story in this election because everybody focuses on the immigrants coming from Mexico into the U.S. But what about all the private jets that go from the U.S. into Mexico? And why? Because Mexico is the origin of the supply chain for the United States, except it's a stronger origin than China. It has better quality control. It's more sophisticated. It's more integrated. So I think we might see that intensify, that relationship. China, too, by the way, is dealing with Mexico. And it becomes a kind of backdoor way they get to work with the U.S. on some things. Again, what will be the tenor of the relationship between the U.S. and China under Trump? Not clear yet, but honestly, second term, he has already said he's going to open with fixing Ukraine in a day. Now, people laughed, but actually, it looks like all the powers that be are lining up for a deal. Right? Zelensky is now calling for a deal. Putin said, I've been ready for ages. The Chinese are like, we're all in. And the only break on that, actually, ironically, has been the current White House that said, well, we want a deal too, but not until September, October, because we want it to count for the voters. And Putin and Xi have been like, okay, fine, but we're going to make your life hell between now and then, right? We're trying to force you to the negotiating table. But, ultimately all of them, and even Kennedy, have all said, let's get to a deal. And so I think that's coming. Once that happens, the tension between the US and China is already starting to diminish, right? Because then China's not supplying Russia to fight the West in Ukraine any longer.
But what about the tariffs, though? Trump has talked about like ramping up the tariffs from China into the US. I mean, will that be a problem? So, sort of militarily, there'll be sort of de-escalation, you could say, but then on the economic front, there could be an escalation.
I think that the Chinese increasingly understand what Trump is calling for. The issue isn't the tariffs, the issue is the behavior. And so if they want to persist with certain behaviors, then this will be the consequence and price. It's not the tariffs that stand alone. They are a tool that he's using to try to compel them into another way of approaching things. My personal view is that within China, there is now a lot of pressure from the Communist Party on Xi, saying basically, why is it you keep talking about going to war with the United States? Let's go back to making money. Like, why do we need to have that confrontation? So will we have a fight over Taiwan? Will China continue to, export, not just export cheap products, but the perception is they're stealing Western technology. If those behaviors persist, then we get one outcome. But if they have an internal change in their conversation and they start to say, let's focus more on making friends internationally and let's cut some deals and go back to making money again. Because honestly, the Chinese economy is so up the creek. They can't afford a war and they can't afford not to have the economy in motion. So I suspect that, Xi is under a lot of pressure. And I think that will matter. And that might make it easier for the US and China to come to a more accommodative stance than we've seen.
We haven't talked about Biden so far. So, I mean, everyone's written him off in terms of being able to win the election, after the presidential debate. His performance obviously was quite poor. There's some speculation around he may get replaced by somebody, but even then, people are saying whoever gets replaced by just won't be able to, have a chance of winning. I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. And just, for background, I've long argued that I think it's going to come down to a choice not between Biden or his replacement and Trump, but Kennedy and Trump. And people thought, again, that was crazy. But the most recent poll numbers from Zogby before the assassination attempt on President Trump, they did a survey of 26,000 people, which is 10 times the normal survey sample size. And it showed Kennedy beating Biden by 100 electoral college votes and beating Trump by 2. And so he was the only candidate that could beat Trump. And like I said, he kind of owns the youth. And frankly, I think we're going to end up with, 3 names on the ballots. And I know a lot of controversy. People say, well, he's only on 8 ballots. But I think he's got the signatures. He's going to be on the ballots. There are only 2 states that I know of left where there's even a question mark. So people are going to see Trump, Biden, or some replacement, and Kennedy, which they'll read as anybody else. And it could even be Mickey Mouse. And I do think there's a big part of the American psyche now that's saying, I just want anybody else. I just, almost a protest vote. And honestly, we love electing long shot outsiders. And we have a long history. Bill Clinton was a long shot outsider. George W. was a long shot outsider. Obama was a long shot outsider. Trump obviously was. In fact, the only exception to the rule is Biden, who was a never Trump vote. And so are we going to revert to our usual pattern? I suspect there's still juice in this. So I don't think it's a done deal totally on Kennedy's story. But I think when we talk about what's coming, I don't see a Democrat who can swing this. The Democratic National Committee and the Democratic Party genuinely believe that it doesn't matter who they field. The person isn't important. What's important is the party and the machinery. that may or may not be true, but I don't think it's true. And we now have a country where as many as 50% plus Americans no longer identify as Democrat or Republican. They identify as independent. Now, that's a first time in history situation. So my bet, which is a really radical outside of the box idea, my bet is that what we're witnessing is the end of the sixth party system and the beginning of the seventh. Now, people are like, what? So you forget that we've had 5 different party systems in America, meaning we used to have Whigs and we used to have Federalists, and we 5 times had different parties that all imploded, stopped working, and we started again. And so we're now on the 6th version of that. That's why it's called the 6-party system. I think we're about to be in the 7th, and the 7th will probably be this new party that Kennedy has put together, the We the People Party. Whether it's his or it's some other name, what it represents is that independent movement that is very real in America now, and I don't think it's going to subside. The Democrats are going to have to reinvent themselves if they get trounced in this coming election. By definition, you have to. And even the Republicans are having to redefine who they are, because there's still lots of Republicans who are not in alignment with President Trump. So all of them are going to have to go through this sort of transformation and redefinition. And I'm not even sure the terms left and right really help us anymore, right? We now have, Republicans with many what used to be considered Democrat positions and vice versa. So there's a need for the nation to kind of go back to scratch and say, wait, what are the values exactly represented by which parties? So can the Democrat and Republican parties implode and simply cease to exist? It's happened 5 times before.
And, some people kind of catastrophize and say there's a chance of a civil war in the US, that it's so polarized, that tensions are so high, we could get some kind of civil war. May not be like the actual civil war in the 1800s, but do you think there is some kind of risk of a breakdown in the country in some way?
Well, look, let's talk about the definition of a breakdown in the country. We've had separatist and secessionist movements in the United States really intensifying since about 2012, in my opinion. And people make fun of it. They go, well, Texas is never going to secede from the Union. But the point is the number of signatures that support that has been rising rather dramatically. So this tells you there's a frustration, a desire to have more control at the state level than the federal level. And what do the polls tell us? The polls are telling us that the 2 most popular people with the highest backing are Trump and Kennedy. And what do both of them say? States should have more power. Federal government should be smaller. So the public's, in fact, already voted. They've already decided they agree with that. So if the motion of travel, the direction of travel is for that, then the question is, who's going to fight that? And so I thought it was very interesting when the Supreme Court ruling came down about, presidents having immunity for official actions. And the whole discussion was about how Trump might use that immunity, but not one word about how Biden might use that immunity, or how some future Democrat might use that immunity. So we kind of assume that all the trouble is only going to happen on one side. That I'm not sure is really true. But look, the good news is I was reading some de Tocqueville recently, because he was such a brilliant observer of American politics. And he said, the great strength of America is not that it's flawless. It's that when it has its problems, it recognizes them and it's quicker to fix them than any other nation. And I think that's true in the business community, right? We hit a wall at the business level, at the economy level. We're super fast to acknowledge it, fix it, move on. I think we're capable of doing the same thing in politics. And the tone that we're increasingly hearing from these 2 most popular candidates is, let's talk about unification. Let's talk about all working together. So I'm an optimist. I don't think we're headed into what Hollywood has been promoting lately.
Okay, understood. Now, you for a long time you lived in the UK, in London, and so you've had a keen eye observing Europe. I mean, what are your thoughts on Europe? We obviously had recent European elections where there was a shift to the right. We had the French elections recently, which
Lola?
which swung back the other way. But nevertheless, things seem to be happening within Europe. I mean, so what are some of the trends or themes you think that are important for us to consider?
Sure. Well, let's step back for a moment. The big one that I've been talking about since about 2015, and I wrote a book at that time about it, was the way we decided to bail out the financial crisis was to drop interest rates to pretty much zero, print money, and this ensured an inflationary response. And at the time, everybody laughed and said, inflation is dead. And it turns out it wasn't dead. And inflation spurs geopolitics. And it basically it brings into light a fundamental issue, which is that every society has a social contract. That's a series of promises that bind us all together, like you can retire at 65 if you work, or if you are paying your taxes, then Social Security exists for you. There are certain promises that people believed in, but many things have changed, and the debt burden effectively rips apart the promises that held us together. And every time that happens, the public say, wait a minute, why are you in charge? Now, that question then manifests itself in America in this upheaval in politics that we're seeing. It's equally doing so in Britain and Europe. So it's the same phenomena. It's the ripping apart of the social contract that is making the public say, wait a minute, why are you in charge? And I want to try somebody else. Now, the somebody else option is going to be usually on the extreme. On the left, the young especially are keen to try socialism, partly because they've never experienced it. So you can tell them how socialism ends, but I always say, in the world of economics, it sounds so crazy, but it's just like falling in love. You can tell someone you're kind of dating the wrong person and I don't think this is going to work out for you, but no, people are going to try it. And they have hope and belief, and they have to learn through their own personal experiences. You can tell them about the Dutch tulip fiasco, but they're still gonna buy something if the whole market is buying it and they get caught up, right? Look at NFTs. So this is the point. People are gonna try socialism because they think there's a third way. If they think that the third way isn't going to work, they're going to say, well, let's go back to an authoritarian approach. And maybe it didn't work before, but we can make it work now. So people are testing different ways of solving the fundamental problems in front of us. So we can't be surprised to see a lot of swinging around. So let's think of it this way. By introducing free money and printing and restoring inflation, we've also brought volatility into politics. That's the equation. If you step away from price stability in central banking, you will bring volatility to politics. And just to finish on this, think of it this way. The interest rate is basically an instrument of social justice. And when government or central bankers decide to tilt it in favor of the speculators against the interests of the savers, or in favor of the savers against the interests of the speculators, volatility ensues. And that is why price stability is so important. And this is a big question in my mind, regardless of who's in charge in any of these places, what can be done to bring inflation down and restore price stability? Because if you can do that, you can take the volatility out of politics.
Okay, no, that's a fair point. And on the inflation question, central bankers at the moment seem fairly confident that inflation is going to fall back towards their targets. Inflation has been falling for the past year or so. Do you share that same level of confidence or not?
I think it all depends on, are we going to continue to be in geopolitical conflict, because war is inflationary. It just is. If we are going to have an accommodation between the superpowers, that's a peace dividend, and that's disinflationary. My personal bet has been we are going to get a peace dividend. There's going to be a deal on Ukraine. I think once that happens, the Russian and Chinese support of the Houthis and Hamas will diminish as well, which will take the heat out of the Middle East crisis. It doesn't totally fix it, but it takes the heat out of it. If we can come to some kind of arrangement over Taiwan, which is not to say a deal, but maybe an agreement to postpone the argument, all of that is a peace dividend. And peace dividends are rare. And I find people in markets are very, very good at assessing downside risk. Like they can find every little bit of trouble that's going to be anywhere on the horizon. We can discount the downside really well. We're terrible at discounting upside. And so I think we should think of a deal in Ukraine as potentially like when the Berlin Wall fell. And suddenly we're going to be in a very different environment that's much more positive for the future. So I'm betting on the upside, but as you get toward that kind of a deal, it gets super noisy, right? There's a lot of arguing and fighting, and it's going to sound worse and worse and worse until somebody says, we've got a deal. The minute that happens, okay, markets are going to be off to the races. And I'll go a little further. I don't think we're just going to be rebuilding Ukraine. We're going to be rebuilding Russia. And I know that sounds so crazy, but we got to find a way to bring Russia back into the family of nations. Otherwise, we're going to be in a fight again at some future date. And so the business of ending Ukraine also will include how to resolve the broader differences. And again, who's going to negotiate that? If we end up with Trump, that's going to be, I think, a more accommodating outcome. If we end up with Biden or one of his successors, I gravely doubt we're going to end up with that possibility in front of us. So, that's a bet. But I suspect right now, again, since Kennedy and Trump are the most popular, both of them have said, we got to find a way to bring Russia into the global picture, because otherwise they're going to continue to be a thorn in the side of the whole world economy. And it's expensive. It's costly to everyone. By the way, China's going to need help too, because they're not competitive anymore and they don't have any great advantage anymore over the rest of the world. So you can't say to 1.3 billion people, sorry guys, you're not competitive. Sayonara, good luck, right? You can't cancel China. We're going to have to find a way for China to be brought into the world economy. I have a view on how that's going to happen. I think it's already unfolding, which is China's moving more aggressively into Siberia, the eastern part of Russia. They are building across the north of North Korea, the Tulum Bridge project. And basically what they're saying is if we need to grow, that means we need access to protein, water, forestry, mined assets, access to land, and strategically access to the Arctic, because that's the shortest supply route to Europe, but also it gives us access to the Sea of Japan over the north of North Korea. Russia's going to say, this is great. China's investing in us. They're giving us infrastructure. They're going to lift a part of the country that's traditionally been, untouched by development. And fundamentally, that means China's about to double in size. Now, the border doesn't actually move, but the economy has the chance to grow. And in a way that's not a problem for the West, because most Americans don't even know where Siberia is. They won't notice that this is happening. But for both Russia and China, that's an opportunity to grow without having to take somebody else's lunch, as it were. So again, I've been very pessimistic about China for a long time, but this is my first time I'm like, maybe this is a way that they can grow out of their difficulties.
That's fascinating. It's a fascinating thesis, and I sort of look forward to following that now. I haven't heard that view before. Now, you mentioned earlier deep tech, and I know you do have a background in different aspects of deep tech. I think recently you've had some involvement in sort of space exploration and things like that. So, when you think about innovation and tech and deep tech, what are the types or the areas that excite you the most?
Sure. So we're in the midst of a truly historic revolution in technology. This is not just one or two interesting inventions. This is a radical transformation of humanity's relationship to reality. So this is the Industrial Revolution on steroids. So for example, because of AI in conjunction with supercomputing, humanity is no longer constrained by the materials that exist in nature, right? Usually we have to start with a material, take a piece of wood, we shape it into a boat, right? A canoe. Now we can start with what is it we want to create, and we can build the materials atom by atom by atom. Google has just recently announced their AI genome with 280,000 new materials that humanity's never seen before. So what are we going to build with all that? The answer is literally the only constraint is imagination. We are changing our relationship with reality in other ways. So for example, space, we're in a proper space race, which I write about a lot. And it is an intense, real geopolitical race between the superpowers and some of the secondary powers to get into space. What is that about? It's about the possibility of unlimited energy, both from space-based solar power and from nuclear fusion. And you need helium-3 to nuclear fusion, and there's lots on the moon. Hence, it matters who gets to that supply first. Space represents the best physics lab humanity's ever had access to. And so, for example, the first space-based factory, which went up and has already come back, was making what? Pharmaceuticals, because it turns out that you can bind certain ingredients in zero gravity that won't bind in gravity. That's why all the pharma companies have projects on the International Space Station. But now we're growing things like protein and plants and all sorts of things. So this zero gravity environment suddenly opens possibilities that were never possible within gravity. That alone is a revolution. And then finally, things that are happening on Earth, like, for example, the Saudis have, started testing the machines that allow you to pull moisture out of the desert air. So now we can have water in the middle of the desert. These things were unimaginable even a few years ago. We could get into the whole thing going not just out into space, but the opposite direction, down into the human genome, into nano level. And the exploration at that end of the spectrum is equally critical and important to the thriving of humanity. So what I see is just unlimited punching through problems with ever greater speed. And the more quantum and supercomputing that we get access to, which we are, the faster and easier it is to do this problem solving, especially in collaboration with AI. So I honestly think the young people of the world, they're going to look at any problem and they're going to say, why is this a problem? We could fix this. And they will use the phone in their pocket, which has more computational power than we needed to get a human on the moon in the first place. And they will use it. And they will be able to draw on all of the tools that exist today to fundamentally solve what were previously intractable problems and literally renegotiate our relationship with reality itself.
Wow, that sounds quite amazing. That sounds quite remarkable. Yeah. And I think, and as you said earlier, people in markets, tend to be more on the pessimistic side. And even if there is a good story, they tend to find it hard to price structural changes, which is what you're talking about here.
Oh, well, by the way, I agree. So if we look back at the history of, say, the US stock markets, let's take the S&P. What percentage of the current S&P even existed 30 years ago? I think it's like less than 5%.
Okay, yeah.
Right? Like, basically, guess what? It's all constantly changing. So the question is, who's the NVIDIA of tomorrow? It's not what is the share price of NVIDIA tomorrow. I mean, you can play with that or you can make a lot of money on that, but I would bet that most traders totally did not catch NVIDIA on day one and got the full performance that we've seen. They got drawn in as they got convinced that there was some technological innovation. But what are they waiting for? They're always waiting to go like, oh, it's a good idea, but I'm not sure that'll work. And of course, by the time it works, it's too late to make the money. So the market's full of people who are constantly excited because they caught 1/10 of the move. I think the future belongs to those who are able to invest the time and effort to understand the technology, and they can catch a lot more of that move. And they'll notice things like here's a quick example. Semiconductors. The current view is, well, NVIDIA has to be worth this much because we have the semiconductor shortage, and Taiwan is super important because they're the ones who can make these things in volume. That's true today. But we already see that the new generation of semiconductors are being built in the United States, not in Taiwan. And they're no longer these micro mini things that go into an iPhone. The new ones are the size of a dinner plate, right? They're made by Cerberus and they do trillions of transactions. They don't do billions of transactions anymore. And that's needed for the new supercomputing and all of the data that needs to be processed. And so now Cerberus is doing their IPO. I think it's JP Morgan who's leading that. I'd have to double check that. But, people in the know are like, is Cerberus the NVIDIA killer? Possibly, yes. And isn't Cerberus alone? No. There are other highly innovative semiconductor companies. And guess what the next location of semiconductor production is already? The preparation to make them in space. Why? Natural clean room, naturally cold. All can be done with robotics. You don't need a single human present. And suddenly also, because of zero gravity, much higher efficiency of the chips that are produced. So this is the thing. You can play with NVIDIA today, but it's so much more interesting to play with the future of semiconductors tomorrow. And so I think that's what is coming for all of the traders in the market. They cannot do this sort of sitting back in the armchair and, well, it's been like this for 30 years. Yeah, we are in a revolution and it's on every front. So now's the time. And that's why I've spent a lot of time investing my time in learning new technologies and getting involved with startups. Like I've just become part of the C10 labs at the MIT Media Lab because they're an incubator of AI companies. They're a venture builder of AI companies. So that's a front row seat on the innovations that are happening. I'm doing the same in some other categories. Space is definitely one of them. Nuclear fusion is one of them. I need to understand quantum. As far as I can tell, even the experts in quantum don't understand quantum, right? So that's something to really get your teeth into. Will that help you better make money in future? My bet is yes. Absolutely yes.
Okay, no, that's great. I'm sure I could have you talking. We could talk much, much longer, but I did want to sort of wrap up our conversation with a couple of more personal sort of questions. One was, what advice would you give to youngsters leaving university today or this year, say?
Oh, look, I think there's been a massive change from my generation to this new one. My generation, you got paid to be a specialist. This new generation, you're going to get paid to be a generalist that can do, and I don't mean a generalist who doesn't have a clue about any particular thing. I mean being a polymath, being someone who can do pattern recognition, who can step back and connect the dots between many different silos to see broader patterns amongst them, especially in a time of massive technological change. So polymaths are going to be the game, not specialists. That would be number one. And that means you have to go try a lot of different things and you have to learn a lot of different things. And you should, this idea that, there's a career path. I don't even think there was a career path in my generation, to be honest. It's only when you look back, you see there's a path, but you cut it yourself in your own particular way. Today, that you can literally be a digital nomad. You can create a company. I think Sam Altman is right. And also Elon Musk, they both said we're on the brink of, single person unicorns. We are not needing to have big corporations to make money anymore. Very small groups of brilliant people are now able to collaborate. They don't even need to be in the same office. They're creating immense value. That means there's no job. It's rather a constant act of creation. And I finished on this. LinkedIn, it totally doesn't work anymore because LinkedIn assumes you have one job. But that's not how people are working. Everybody's got a portfolio now. They're advising their old company they used to work for. That's a part-time role. They are creating a startup. They're working with a friend who's creating a startup. They're working on multiple things at the same time. So this portfolio approach is much smarter because if any one of them doesn't work, some of them will. It's a better approach to diversifying your risk. And anybody who says, well, but you're much safer taking a job with a big bank. I'm like, have you seen what the longevity is like in big banks? In my generation, a big bank made sense because they paid big bonuses and you got the money. Today, they're going to hire you and you'll be gone in 2 or 3 years. There's no loyalty. And whatever equity you're given, it's going to be worth nothing. So it's a kind of false promise. So I think young people are figuring this out and they're like, I'm not joining the establishment or having a career path. I am creating my own future. And that's the ultimate content creation is you produce your own future.
That's fantastic. Great advice. They're very inspirational. Finally, in terms of books, are there any sort of books that you'd recommend, books that have influenced you or recent books that you've come across that you think, our listeners should read?
So I'm a librarian at heart and a massive library, which normally is up behind me, but I'm moving house. I'm still in boxes. I haven't sorted my office yet. But gosh, I don't know that there's any one. I was hugely influenced by Peter Drucker's first book called The End of Economic Man. And that was the book he wrote when he was quite young. And where he said, I think World War II is coming. And he was very afraid to write it because it was still only a possibility. And he did get brave enough. He did publish it just before the war began. But it was considered outrageous and radical and like, what? Why do you think we're going to have a war? I do think we're in a similar moment today. And I've been arguing for the last 2 years that we are already in World War III. It's just a different kind of war. It's not the kind of boots on the ground, except in Ukraine. It's a more technological war, and it's being fought in space and with the cutting of subsea cables around the world and that stuff. So if you want to kind of get a sense of perspective on, where are we now? I think that book is very interesting. And his observations of the signals that he saw that led him to believe we're in some trouble might sharpen your observational skills of what signals do we see today and where are they leading? And are they leading to another conflagration or are they leading to a resolution? I still stay on the resolution side of that argument.
That's fantastic. And I should ask, what's the best way for people to follow your work?
So I write a column on Substack under Dr. Pippa's Pen and Podcast. I've been so busy in the last couple of years. I haven't launched the podcast yet, but I am heavy in motion with it. And that's the best place. I'm pretty active on Twitter. I put up a lot of material on LinkedIn as well. Those are my main social media platforms. But the one where I really do super deep dives into what's going on with references and links to the original news articles, that's all on my Substack page.
Okay, I'll make sure to include the links on the show notes. So with that, thanks a lot, Pippa. It's been fantastic talking to you. I hope you will be able to do this again. And, good luck and continue the good work.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.